Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofOutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Stars TV series and everything in between. This is podcast episode 143, and we are in week 28 of the Drums of Autumn read-along. We will be covering chapters 54 through 56, and maybe I'll just do 57 without notes. We'll see. I'm not sure about that. I'm calling this episode Prisoners of Circumstance. And the summary goes something like this. Roger met a priest. His situation became direr as he was thrown into a hut with the man. The priest was on trial. The priest was tortured. Roger became more worried and comforted the man the best way he could. Brianna was trapped at River Run in a gilded cage. Jocasta was parading her to the eligible men in the area because she didn't think Roger would return. Brianna found out she was now the heir to River Run. She didn't want it for the same reasons Claire and Jamie hadn't. The priest believed the Mohawk would kill him. Roger took his confession, but the priest sought no absolution. Inside the chapters, Chapter 54, Captivity I. Roger tracked his time in the Mohawk village by tying knots in his string. Nearly 3 months had passed. When he arrived, he didn't know what type of tribe they were. He was made to strip bare and endure a ceremonial ritualistic trial. He was hit, poked, and lashed. His body was punished until he reached the longhouse and stood before them. This brutal scene highlighted the depth of his strength. We're actually getting to see what Roger's really made out of. He's a patently 20th century man. He's a professor. He's a historian. He's a musician. In the wilderness, those skills don't have a lot of bearing. Except being a historian, he may have some knowledge, but he has no on-the-ground training for any of this. So he is having to pull from what he already has internally, even if he's never had to use it this way. They barked and laughed at him, but then gave him means to clean himself and food in the longhouse. He slept with his hand over the gems his breeches still hid. He became the longhouse slave. If he ignored them, they beat him. It was an effective tool to gain his obedience. They did, however, feed him well and give him a comfortable place to sleep. Even though they didn't speak to him often, he picked up some of their language by listening carefully. He practiced words on a young girl and her friends. They taught him the language over the weeks. He learned from them what tribe he was with, the Kahnyen kehaka, also known as the Mohawk. They called him a not-so-endearing term that meant dog-face because of his beard. Regardless of term, when we look at tribal peoples in the United States, they are not hairy at all, like white people are. They have very little body hair. So they don't think it's attractive at all. It's unusual to them. It's not their norm. His foot was tended to by one of the girl's mother. The women began to talk to him when he brought them wood or water. He wanted to escape, but the timing was wrong, so he patiently waited. His nightly dreams were of Bree, or at least the smell of her. Imagine his situation, really. And he's wounded. He doesn't have anybody debriding it, anybody helping get the infection out. I mean, putting a poultice on there is probably not enough for something that's quite infected by this point. Late in winter, a Jesuit priest was brought to the village by another group of Mohawk. The man's robes were tattered, and though not appearing to be a prisoner, Roger believed he did not come on his own accord. The priest was taken into the longhouse where the sachem held council meetings. Those are the leaders. He went on a hunting trip to help carry the kill back and returned to find men waiting for him. He was grabbed and taken to the small hut where the Jesuit priest was being held. Roger learned the man's name, Père Alexandre Ferigault. So it's Father Alexandre Ferigault. Basic information was exchanged between them, and the priest invited Roger to eat with him. Roger didn't know why he was brought to be with the priest. They discussed Roger's situation. "How did you come to be taken captive?" Roger hesitated, not really knowing how to answer. "I was betrayed," he said at last, "sold." The priest nodded sympathetically. "Is there anyone who might ransom you? They will take care to keep you alive, if they have some hope of ransom." Roger shook his head, feeling hollow as a drum. "There's no one." That is a pretty devastating response. He doesn't know that Bree knows where he is, or that Claire and Jamie and young Ian, along with Rollo, are in the village right now. He has no idea. He has no idea that he's placed in holding because they're negotiating for his release. To him, it looks like he's going to be killed. He has no idea what's happening. They're not telling them anything. The priest had only been in the hut a short time before Roger. This concerned Roger. The priest told Roger they were deciding whether he lives or dies. Later, Mohawk men came into the tent and made the priest strip and tormented him with a hot brand before dragging him away. Roger tried to pray for the priest as he asked of him. He could only wonder if someone would pray for him when he was taken away. Exhausted, Roger slept by the fire. The priest returned, or rather was returned, to the hut. He was still naked and bleeding. The priest had been tortured, but was alive. Roger tried to soothe him, but was helpless. Roger cursed himself for helplessness. He would have given anything to assuage the other man's pain, even for a moment. It wasn't merely sympathy, and he knew it. Father Alexandre's small, breathless sounds kept the knowledge of the mutilation fresh in Roger's mind and terror alive in his blood. If the priest could only sleep, the sounds would stop, and perhaps in the darkness, the horror would recede a bit. For the first time, he thought he understood what it was that made Claire Randall tick, made her walk onto battlefields, to lay her hands on wounded men. To ease pain and death in another was to soothe the fear of it in oneself, and to soothe his own fear he would do almost anything. At last, unable to bear the whispered prayers and stifled whimpering any longer, he lay down beside the priest and took Alexandre in his arms. And he told him to hush and it would be okay. Roger held the man and rubbed him to provide comfort. Roger couldn't stop talking and thought not even a dog would be treated so harshly. This man had been quite abused. A strip of skin was taken off from behind his ear, from his scalp, and he was beaten. And this man is also emotionally tormented, right? There's so much going on. And without Roger knowing, that his potential salvation is right outside of that hut negotiating for his release with whiskey and small baubles, maybe he wouldn't have been so fearful. But how would he ever know that Jamie Fraser, the man who nearly beat him to death and sent him away to be with the Mohawk, would be the very person to try and save him? He had no idea. So Roger's spirit is also deeply wounded. His body is wounded. And now he's faced with this priest and having no idea what the connection is and why he's here with him. He's probably feeling a bit hopeless right now, is my guess. Chapter 55, Captivity I, River Run, March, 1770. Brianna was working on a painting when Jocasta and Ulysses came up behind her. She loved the company of Aunt Jo, but she didn't want Ulysses sharing every detail of what she was doing to her aunt. She didn't seem to like Ulysses very much, as he was her aunt's eyes. She didn't like being watched and reported on. She took her sketchbook, not wanting prying eyes to look through it. There was a visitor, and Aunt Jo wanted her to change for lunch. Bree did not appreciate the number of visitors and social obligation she had to see them at her aunt's request. The most recent visitors were men. Phèdre told her minimal single women were in the area, especially not younger women, and women set to inherit a plantation. This is news to Brianna. Brianna insisted Phèdre tell her all about the inheritance. Your auntie ain't told you yet. Thought sure you knew. Or I'd not have said. Well, now you've said that much, go on saying. What do you mean? Phèdre, a born gossip, took little coaxing. Your daddy and them hadn't gone but a week before Miss Jo sent for a lawyer Forbes and had her will changed. When Miss Jo dies, there's some little bits of money goes to your daddy, and some personal things to Mr. Farquhar, and some of her other friends, but everything else, that's yours. The plantation, the timber, the sawmill. But I don't want it. Phèdre's elegantly lifted eyebrow expressed profound doubt, then dropped, dismissing it. Well, it ain't what you want, I reckon. Miss Jo is kind of inclined to get what she wants. Brianna laid the hairbrush down slowly. And just what does she want? Do you happen to know that too? Ain't any big secret. She wants River Run to last longer than she does, and to belong to somebody from her blood. Seems sense to me. She got no children, no grandchildren. Who else is there to carry on after her? That's some wisdom right there. Phèdre just spells it out. Once a Mackenzie, always a Mackenzie, that Jocasta. Since Jamie left to live in the mountains, eschewing Jocasta's proposal, Brianna was it. Brianna was slow to realization. Jocasta was trying to pick a suitable husband for her. She's trying to pick a husband for me? She's showing me off like some prize heifer? Uh-huh. Phèdre appeared to see nothing wrong with this. She frowned, drawing a straying lock skillfully into the main braid. But she knows about Roger, about Mr. Wakefield. How can she be trying to marry me off to... Phèdre sighed, not without sympathy. I don't reckon she thinks they're going to find the man. Tell you true, Miss Jo, she knows a bit about the Indians. We've all heard Mr. Myers tell about the Iroquois. It was chilly in the room, but prickles of sweat broke out along Brianna's hairline and jaw. Besides, Phèdre went on, weaving a blue silk ribbon into the braid, Miss Jo don't know this Wakefield. Might be he'd not be a good manager. Better, she thinks. to get you married to a man she knows will take care of her place. Add it to his own, maybe. Make a truly grand place for you. I don't want a grand place. I don't want this place. Outrage, in turn, was giving way to panic. It didn't matter what Brianna wanted. It was all about Jocasta. Bree opened her sketchbook. She had drawn a picture in the profile of Roger. She could bring him near when she looked at the sketch. The sketches of her parents caused fear in her. Would they come back? Ulysses came in to light the candles so Jocasta could orient herself in the room when she came in. Brianna watched him setting everything precisely so Jocasta would know where it was. She knew he placed furniture back in its proper location for Jocasta's safety and movement through the house. His life was devoted fully to Jocasta. A whole life devoted to the needs of someone else. Ulysses could read and write both French and English, could reckon numbers, could sing and play the harpsichord. All that skill and learning, used only for the entertainment of an autocratic old lady. To say to one, come, and he cometh. To say to another, go, and he goeth. Yes, that was Jocasta's way. And if Jocasta had her way, she would own this man. The thought was unconscionable. Worse, it was ridiculous. She shifted impatiently in her seat, trying to push it away. He caught the slight movement and turned inquiringly to see if anything was wanted. She blurted out a question to Ulysses, then was immediately embarrassed and apologized. Did he want to be free? He answered by telling her his life story. He was born free, but after his father died, his mother sold herself into slavery, and he, with the money, was given to a carpenter to become an apprentice later to learn a trade. But when he came of age, the carpenter insisted he was the child of a slave. So he was a slave, and refused to apprentice him. He was sold. But that's not right. He looked at her, in patient amusement, but didn't speak. What had right ever had to do with it? His dark eyes said, I was fortunate, he said. I was sold, cheaply, for I was very small and puny, to a schoolmaster, whom several plantation owners on the Cape Fear had hired to teach their children. He would ride from one house to another, staying in each for a week or a month, and I would go with him, perched behind him on the horse's rump, tending the horse when he stopped, and doing such small services as he required. And because the journeys were long and tedious, he would talk to me as we rode. He sang. He loved to sing, that man, and he had a most delightful voice. To Brianna's surprise, Ulysses looked faintly nostalgic, but then he shook his head, recalling himself, and took a cloth from his pocket, with which he wiped the sideboard. It was the schoolmaster who gave me the name Ulysses, he said, back turned to her. I knew some Greek and some Latin as well, and for his amusement he taught me to read on the nights when darkness befell us and we were forced to encamp on the road. When the schoolmaster died as well, I was a young man of 20 or so. Hector Cameron bought me and discovered my talents. Not all masters would value such endowments in a slave, but Mr. Cameron was not a common man. Ulysses smiled faintly. He taught me to play chess and would wager upon my success, playing against his friends. He had taught me to sing and to play the harpsichord, that I might provide entertainment for his guests. And when Miss Jocasta began to lose her sight, he gave me to her, to be her eyes. What was your name? Your real name? He paused, thinking, then gave her a smile that did not reach his eyes. I'm not sure that I remember, he said politely, and went out. That is quite a story. He was born free. When his father died, he was free. His mother had to sell herself to get enough money to give to someone to apprentice him. But then it was twisted because the law is the law. And he was in a colony where slavery thrived. And the rules made it very easy to enslave other people. It's horrifying. I wouldn't want to own River Run either. Gosh. It's one thing if somebody owes you a debt and they decide to come and work the debt off for 5 years and then they're released from your household. Or if somebody cannot afford to live and they asked to come to live and work in your household, that's totally a different scenario. Even though it's still tragic, and I cannot imagine having somebody come to me and say, I can't afford to feed my children. Can we come and work for you? But when households needed staff, Jenny had staff. She took Mary McNabbin and her son, and they worked in the house. She didn't own them. They weren't slaves, but they worked for her. Their ability to live was determined by the Murrays and the success of Lallybroch, right? At least it's an option for employment when households required support. My house is big enough to bring somebody else in. I don't really have the money to pay somebody and house them and feed them so they can do things for me here. It's a different way of thinking, and modernity and giving us things like electricity and washers and dryers and refrigerators and stoves really have taken away the need for us to have other people living in our home to help us survive and thrive, as well as modern agriculture where we have grocery stores and we don't have to grow and slaughter our own animals. We don't have to weave our own fabrics. We don't have to grow everything ourselves or trade for it. So it's a lot different. Quite different. And even I know many farmers and ranchers, and though their life is by far more physical than mine is, and they do require extra hands, it's still not the same as it was because they have modern farming equipment as well, and they have modern veterinary for their animals, and it's a lot of work, yes, and it's dawn to dark work, but it's still different when they can come into their house and they have electricity and flush toilets, and they don't have to make their own clothes. So, it's a reality check for certain. Chapter 56, Confessions of the Flesh. Roger woke without the priest near him. The priest was certain he would die soon. They would kill him. Roger didn't believe it. Père Ferigault asked Roger to hear his confession. He explained that in time of need, any man could act as a priest. This is something that will come up a multitude of times in the books, okay? And think on that. It's pretty interesting because in the Catholic faith, that's true. I'd have to look it up to see if it still holds true today, but I believe so. But in the Protestant faith, it's a little different. People can, and they do, and they have their own home churches, and they baptize, and you can anoint someone. It's just, I've never heard it put quite this way in the Protestant church. Roger agreed to hear the confession. The priest told Roger where he came from and where his mission had been. He spent 2 years with a Huron. He met a tribal chief and was invited to his village. Knowing the Mohawk resisted religious conversion, he jumped at the opportunity. This was his first sin, pride. Many converted, including the chief, but the sachem disagreed with his influence. His second sin was falling in love with one of the converts. He lived with the woman for many months, until one day he saw a vision while bathing in the stream. He immediately moved out of the longhouse and into the wilderness, and had left her pregnant. This itself was not an issue because the Mohawk viewed coupling differently than Christians. "Was that what caused the trouble that brought you here?" Roger asked. "No, not in itself. They do not see matters of marriage and morality as we do," Alexandra explained. "Women take men as they will, and marriage is an agreement that endures so long as the partners are in amity. If they should fall out, then the woman may expel the man from her house, or he may leave. The children, if there are children, stay with the mother." And as far as I know, it's still more that way today. There's a bit more of a feminine bent, matriarchal aspect when it comes to coupling, what marriage is, divorce, children. The problem was that he refused to baptize his child because he was not in a state of grace. He offended the village chief. The village was torn by disagreement, and he was brought to this village where Roger stayed so an impartial council could decide his fate. The priest was not seeking absolution from Roger, merely to tell his story. He believed he could not be returned to a state of grace because he refused to reject the sin of loving the woman. So Roger taking the priest's confession foreshadows matters of faith in the future, as I said. Roger is a man who's protective of others and wants to help whenever he can. He and Jamie are not very different, but the way they individually show this protectiveness and need to care for others differs. Both Roger and Brianna are stuck in a prison of sorts. She is no less free than he is. And as Roger faces uncertainty about the future, so does she. She could die because of childbirth, and the Mohawk could kill Roger. Again, he doesn't know there are people waiting for him, trying to save him right now. Why is the priest important? What is the message? Is it to show that even if love can be a sin, if love is a sin, I don't know. This is a confusing aspect to me. And for the priest, he broke his vows and loved a woman and bedded a woman and made a child with a woman. But he hadn't defrocked himself. He wasn't excommunicated. He was no longer a priest. He was still a priest. So is that the problem of his soul? Is that he has to denounce the loving of this woman, therefore making the child a bastard, etc. It's complicated, right? It's complicated. This is where all the social and religious mores are so difficult. And it's really easy to look into another culture and think they're banana pants, right? Just to think that they're off their rocker. Or think people are savages because they do differently. I watched a movie, an Amazon Prime movie last night. And it was about an English soldier who was an explorer and he was looking for the lost city of Zed in the Amazon. And he was trying to express back to the other British that these people aren't savages. They're different, but they have higher order of thought. They must know math. They had a great amount of people and civilization before even the English, right? Because as part of colonialism, the English thought they were tantamount to the best of everything. Hence colonialism, going in, taking over culture, taking resources, and not leaving people be who they were, making people convert, taking away their own culture, stripping them bare, right? And the fact that, like, Roger had to be stripped bare in this Mohawk village, they were stripping him of who he was. They were taking away who he was. They beat him into submission. Even though he was still other and wasn't Mohawk, he had not been adopted in, he wasn't himself either. He is no longer the same, and he is separate from his people. And then when Père Ferigault was brought in, he was stripped. Yes, he was abused, he was beaten. It seems like it may have been worse than what Roger endured, even though that was horrible. We don't know what was going to happen to Roger. Eventually, he may have been adopted into the tribe, but he was given to them as a prisoner. They were told never to let him leave on his own, because that's what Jamie said. And so that's what the Tuscarora friends that took him all the way there, that's what they said to do with him. So the priest was also being stripped of his dignity, of who he was. He's seen as something else. Now, plenty of people would say, oh, that's savage that they would murder him or they would do this. They had order. They had societal order. They had their way. They had their religion. They had their council. There's a brutality to it, but it's no different than the brutality in our own culture. We have plenty of that still. I mean, just look at the foundation of colonialism. It is so brutal. It's so privileged, and it tells other people that they don't matter as much and they're stupid. That's brutal. And then everything taken away. That's generational brutality and people enslaved. I mean, so what's a savage, right? And one of my very favorite books, Brave New World, the savages are who I appreciate in the book. And they're called that because they live outside of society and still birth children on their own and feed their own children. They're not grown in fake wombs. And they're not given drugs to put them in some kind of societal order that will change their development, whether they'll be brilliant leaders or whether they're basically going to be laborers and everything in between that. It's pretty scary. That premise is so scary. That book is 100 years old and it's still, wow. I read it every few years and it blows my mind. So if you've never read Brave New World, but you've read 1984, please read it. There's so many things in Brave New World that are far more challenging and indicative of our culture beyond 1984. At least to me, that's how I perceive it. Anyway, so Brianna is in such a difficult place. I mean, she is absolutely in a vulnerable position. I mean, so is Roger. They both are vulnerable. But she's carrying a baby, and there are risk factors. And she's at the behest of her aunt. And her aunt could just marry her off if she wanted to. She's taking Brianna's lead, essentially, and not just pairing her off with someone. But she's still showing her off. So what do you think about that? I mean, I love how Jocasta is patently a Mackenzie in all her manipulation and force of will to her ends. And Roger is related to her. He doesn't know the force of will he possesses. He's not done being tested. So it'll be interesting to see how the Mackenzie manifests itself, because he's from the line of Dougal, and to see what part of that will actually grow and thrive and be present in Roger as the story unfolds for him. I'm interested in that. And again, Claire, young Ian, and Jamie are at the village, and Roger's sharing the hut with the priest. They barely know that he's there. They have not really said it, but they've been told through the grapevine that Roger's there. They're hopeful, right? But Roger is desperate and desolate and has no clue that anyone is coming after him. And so his situation, young Ian and Jamie and Claire being there, it's about to reach the denouement. We're going to see what happens. And boy, is it a big deal what happens. It's a huge deal. Now, I know some of these podcasts have been over an hour and some have been, like this one, it's only going to be, 40 minutes maybe. I look at the page length when I set out my schedule, because I know I can only do about 30 pages of content, generally of Diana Gabaldon's writing, in an hour. And I like to keep these to an hour because, frankly, an hour of me is plenty. So that's why some of them are shorter and some are just over. But 3 chapters, and I'm only getting this much content. It's because it was easy for me to paraphrase and pull out what was important, and it just wasn't as much. I did not need to go over the detail of every thing that happened in Roger's ritual when they stripped him down and beat him. It's terrible, but I really don't want to relay it word for word. So we're getting to see the things that are mirroring between Roger and Brianna. Just like we got to see how some things were mirrored between Jamie and Claire across time. What's going on with the characters. And I'm really looking forward to next week. We're doing chapters 57 and 58. And if I don't have at least 4 pages of text before I record, I will add chapter 59 as well. Just so you know. So I have a couple of listener emails. The first one is from Francis. Hi, Desiree. Listened to the last podcast twice. A couple of thoughts. And this was for, I think it was 141. I do try to have them once in a while. I was uncomfortable how Jamie showed Brianna that she couldn't fight Bonnet. I knew he had to show her, but it was awfully tough. I do know that I am judging it by today's standards. The idea was right. Many do not believe until they are shown. Frank. His book character is more likable, although I still am not crazy about him. He put constraints on the relationship by not allowing Claire to talk about the biggest part of her core. People adopt children all the time, so people gushing over him for doing that is a bit much for me. The final night of Frank's life was awful. To calmly sit in bed, waiting for Claire and then announce he was leaving, and taking Brianna was very cruel. Show Frank was not a person I would want to be close to. As a historian, he should have had a better understanding on how people react after trauma. I've always wondered how Brianna was shaped by living with her parents, who had a constant stream of negativity, although hidden by politeness, who clearly did not display physical affection and the lack of respect Frank showed regarding Claire as a doctor. When I married into a family who was much more physical than my parents. My parents were great, just not touchy-feely. I know I became more open as well. Thank you, Francis. I think Book Frank and Claire, they did continue to have a physical relationship off and on, even though Claire was not totally open. And she agreed not to talk about Jamie. And so by her stuffing it, it really made that burn stay there just as strong. And by Frank not wanting to hear it, while he was researching about Jamie and the Jacobites and the whole time frame, that was his specialty. Oh, it's so challenging. Yeah. There was a love between them, and there was much more of a companionship between Book Frank and Book Claire. And I think that they did have genuine affection toward each other, even if they weren't always jumping in bed with each other. And Book Frank also did not have an ongoing long-time affair. Yes, Brianna is a product of her parents' marriage. She's a product of that, like you said, lie, where she really had no idea because she took it at face value without question. But there was always that undercurrent that something wasn't quite right between them. She was the glue, and Frank loved her. And I agree with you about the adoption. I've gotten lots of letters about adoption. And I believe that family is made however family is made. Blended families are as old as time. I think the difference in blended families now and adoption, like in our westernized approach, is often children were adopted because somebody died, or they were abandoned and didn't have parents. Families were blended because somebody died, or they abandoned their family and disappeared, and somebody was left widowed, even if they weren't certain the husband died, right? And then families would come together because that meant safety, that meant security, that meant that they could survive and thrive. Because we needed it. And now, because we have such a significant divorce rate, or couples break up, whether they were legally married or not. I'm not going to get on that topic because I have my very own specific views outside of, what the state says about marriage. Anyhow, we have so many couples making children and breaking up, or never being couples, real established couples to begin with, that you have all these integrated, blended families, but the other person is still involved. That's really difficult. I mean, if a child's mother died, then they have a stepmother, hopefully who's not terrible, because it is difficult sometimes. I don't know why for people to love those who aren't their own blood. Frankly, I find loving my own blood half the time far more difficult than loving people who are not blood related to me. People who I've chosen to be part of my family, who are sisters and brothers from another mother, right? So, yes, I think families are formed however they're formed, and adoption is a beautiful thing. And I think it's a sacrificial love, especially in modern Western society, to offer a baby to somebody else when a woman knows that it's not something that she can do. She cannot raise this child, and whatever the situation is. Previously to what we kind of have established now, and it probably still happens in parts of the United States and in other parts of the Western world, and I know in places where out-of-wedlock pregnancy there's a high distaste for it, and people react really vehemently about it. Those women are forced to give their babies up for adoption. It's not because they want to. they're forced to do it. And I'm sure that still happens. And I know that that happened often in our own country when we still had slavery. Those babies were taken from their mothers. Horrifying. Horrifying. They're just making new slaves. So I know that it must happen, or women of all ages are shamed and they're sent away to places to have their baby. It must still happen. One interesting tack that's taken that we'll see come up in the next time is the value of Bree's pregnancy. It's pretty fascinating. And it's so bizarre to think in our 2018 brains. But thank you, Francis. I appreciate you sending this in. And I got another email. I'm not going to read it, but in detail, because there's some very, very personal things in here. But it is another situation about adoption and abortion. So I'm going to leave this one with anonymous, just so I can talk about the content without using names at all, because I think it's important. And on one hand, this was written to me because of my directness and honesty and how I approached discussing abortion in the last podcast. It is so difficult. It's such a charged topic, isn't it? But it really brought up memories for her that she had put away. That's why these books become our friends. They become real people in our minds because they connect to us on extremely deep and personal levels. Diana Gabaldon does not shy away from difficult topics. And how she talks about abortion is amazing to me, especially being Roman Catholic, where I know what is in her head. I mean, I know what the belief system of the church is. And for her to be able to talk about it in a way through her characters' personalities and experiences is really beautiful, that she can step outside of that and really allow her characters to do the talking for themselves. So the basic first part of this email was that she was sure that there was a pregnancy, but there wasn't, and it took a long time to get pregnant. But even thinking about being pregnant was very difficult, and it had tortured her given her situation at the time. And there had to be that contemplation of, what do I do? What are my options? And even though that she wasn't pregnant, she was able to go through all of that. Because in the United States, before abortion was legal, it was happening. It's been happening, like I said last time, since the beginning of time. Since there were people. And it doesn't matter if we want to see it or not, or know it or not, it's real. It does. It exists. So later on, a family member opted to have an abortion, and she supported her family member because of the experience that she had. It's not that she liked it or wanted it, but she had to be with her family member and walk it out with her. That's sacrificial, and that's loving, and that's kind, and that's meeting somebody where they're at. That's amazing, and what a big heart this person has for the situation the individual family member was in. And she commended me for not wanting to go to heroic measures to become pregnant if my husband and I couldn't conceive. In my first marriage, we didn't conceive. And it was something that was on my mind. Like the listener who wrote this email, I had had time to contemplate and consider what my options were. And at the time frame, I mean, my husband and I have been together 24 years. So in my previous marriage, and leading up to this, IVF was a pretty new thing. But after really looking at the process, not just financially, which now it's like $15,000 for an IVF treatment. Somehow people afford that. That's still a lot of money, but when it first came out, it was $50,000. $100,000 for an IVF treatment. And because of my own belief system, I didn't want to have fertilized eggs, a fertilized egg and sperm, embryos frozen. I didn't want to keep life in stasis. I don't know if there's a soul in those or not. I have no idea. I don't. So for me, it was something that I couldn't do. I don't judge other people ever. That's my own personal, I don't want to do that. And I don't want to spend the money. And I don't want to go through the pain and hardship. And we discussed it. And we just decided that if I didn't get pregnant within a certain amount of time, we would find means and ways to adopt children. And we would have. You know, I went through all this process and to great lengths and great discussions. And then on our 6-month wedding anniversary, I was like, I'm ovulating. You want to try for a baby? I know I'm super romantic, right? I'm totally not romantic. And he took about 10 seconds to think about it. He said, sure. And lo and behold, I was pregnant 3 days later. You know, usually it's about 72 hours it takes. But I was pregnant and I had no issues conceiving all 4 of our children. So there you go. But the listener who wrote this email went through a lot of hardship and challenges to ultimately have a baby. And so when you look at all the things that we have to go through as women, none of these are black and white. I just have a big heart because I know why somebody would go to the greatest lengths possible. And like, even when you think of The Handmaid's Tale, and I'm thinking more of the book, the TV show is a whole nother, like, evolved animal. They took a short book and are running with it for several seasons and putting in lots of detail and modernizing it because it was written in the 80s. I mean, it is a very different time from the 1980s. I think I can blink and be 20 again, but I'm 51. We are like a generation and a half away from the 80s now. But using women that you know to be fertile in order to try and create more people and using them only for their fertility. Wow. Yeah. That's the lengths that people would go. I don't doubt it, honestly. I really don't doubt it. I don't think we could turn into The Handmaid's Tale based on lots of things, not across the whole country, right? However, there are aspects of it that could absolutely happen in individuals' lives, in small communities, in a state, in a commune, whatever. It could happen I do think on smaller levels. Anyhow, I digress. And then this listener talks about adoption in her family and what an incredible blessing that is. So they've had lots of challenges and trials when it comes to childbearing and who do you bring into your family? What does family mean? What does support look like? What does love look like? So it's fascinating. And I'm so thankful, dear listener, who I will keep anonymous, that through this adoption process that you have gained an amazing relationship in your family. One of my closest people to me in my family is my niece through marriage. It's my husband's youngest niece. And she's mine. And it's great. And I love her beyond all things. So anyhow, there you go. And then she goes to the last part. And this part I'll just read because it doesn't have to do with all the very personal details. Now I will jump out of my personal story and into the Drums of Autumn fire. I previously wrote you how in my memory, Drums of Autumn seemed like so much prelude, and then the Diana Gabaldon version of the book of Job, aka the trials, abuses, and tribulations of Roger Wakefield Mackenzie. And now I know why. This part of the story is so rife with complications, confusion, lies, obfuscation, and interpersonal strife that it grabs you and makes you angry. All caps. Angry. Oh well, let's gird our loins, love that phrase, and proceed to the longhouse. Thank you, listener. And thank you for sharing. Because your story, when I read it to myself, across email, it just made me cry. And again, this is why it doesn't matter how old you are, where you come from. If you love these books, you will find friends who have vastly diverse stories, have vastly diverse backgrounds, belief systems. I'm curious how many people would read these books and enjoy them if they didn't have a faith. If I could see if you were agnostic, but if somebody was an atheist, it might be a challenge to really love these books. But what do I know? I'm not an atheist, so I can't speak. So if you're an atheist and you love the Diana Gabaldon books, drop me an email, contact@adramofOutlander.com, or a voicemail, 719-425-9444. Also, if you have any comments, thoughts, questions, points to make, you want to tell me how wrong I am about how I interpreted something, email or drop a phone message. I would love to hear it. Oh boy, I've stretched this out far. Look at that. There was so much in these 2 emails to cover, apparently. So, how do you support the podcast? Well, one is listening. Downloading the podcast helps. But sharing it with other people. If you like what I do, and I know what I do is different than any of the other Outlander podcasts. I have a totally different point of view. I have a different way. I'm the only solo person, I believe, doing it. I don't have a partner all the time. And I thank you for sticking with me, because I'm like really glad you're not bored of me and that you don't think I'm just an a-hole or something, thinking I'm so awesome doing this by myself. I do plan on having guests on, but with my schedule as a midwife and everybody else's schedule, it's hard. That's where just being on call all the time makes it challenging. At some point during this podcast experience over the years, I will not be on call anymore. It's going to be fascinating when I'm in nursing school, hopefully starting May 2020. That's my goal. I will have to pre-record probably an entire book. So whatever book we're on at that point, let's see, I'll probably have to do the podcast for all of that, or at least most of those episodes, and release them weekly, because I'm going to be up to my eyeballs in nursing school. But I'm still going to do the podcast, dang it. Still. Going to do it. But that's where my moderators and administrators for the page and group are going to have to help me keep that stuff going really well. But I've added them on. Thank you to Jan and to Patricia for coming on to do that. But yeah, sharing the podcast, sharing the website, telling people, going into Apple Podcast in iTunes and rating the show. If you give me 5 stars, it helps people find me. Tell people why you like it. Hey, send to me why you like it. Because I'm sitting in a box right now talking to you by myself from a script. The other way that you can help the podcast is to join the conversation. On Facebook, we have a Dram of Outlander page, and there's also a Dram of Outlander group. The group you have to ask to join to make sure you are a real person, you're an Outlander fan, you're not a bot, you're not a troll. It's really hard in social media world to know who people are, but in the group, you guys drive the content. And now, thanks to my lovely administrators, they get to help drive the content too. So we want you to interact because Outlander community is amazing. And I want the A Dram of Outlander community to be even more amazing. And I appreciate you guys so much. You rarely require moderation. You are so good. There's so many other groups and pages I've been on where people, it's just like mayhem and chaos and nobody knows how to be an adult. Nobody gets it. It's all about fighting and who can yell louder. And people are really mean and judgmental. And I know I try to set the tone myself by how I present the podcast and how I present especially the really difficult topics. I try and present them in a non-judgmental, open way and to view it through the lens of they're in the 18th century. This is what, and knowing historically how people lived and what it was like. I mean, imagine in 300 years, people looking back at our social media culture. I mean, this might not last, right? We may not keep things like Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and whatever's coming down the line. We might not at all. It's going to evolve into something different, but people are going to see stuff and historic data from this time period and think we're all lunatics. Think about it. I mean, they're going to be judging us from about today. Like we're going through and reading Outlander and looking at the 18th century and trying to parse it out and piecemeal it and figure it out. Everything's in the cloud. What happens if we lose the internet? How much of our history, our modern history, is going to evaporate? So write things down. Have real books in your house. Keep track. Print photographs. Keep your history alive in your own home. Make it so people who come behind you will be able to see it and know. Because it could potentially all disappear. Or there won't be access to it. It's a thought. And you can go to Instagram and Twitter, and it's Dram of Outlander without the A in front. And follow there and talk. If you want to leave me a note or chat with me directly, you either go to Dram of Outlander on Twitter, or you can use the hashtag ADOO for, a Dram of Outlander. Super creative. You can tell where my left brain is, right? I know there are some people who are so wickedly smart and so funny. I just wish I was like that. I'm just like how I am, though. So I've got to take it for what it is. It's been mine for 51 years. The other way to support the podcast is monetarily. I need help. You like what I do? You can go to patreon.com/adramofOutlander and do a monthly offering. Every dollar counts. Trust me. This comes out of my own household budget. So I'm hoping eventually to have sponsors, but to this point, it's not something I have done. I am going to work on it. You guys are very faithful listeners, and the podcast is growing, and it's wonderful. But I do need financial help. If you don't want to do a monthly offering through Patreon, you can always message me or leave a phone message, and I will tell you how to do a one-time offering. Or you can send it to like Venmo or whatever. So, hey, everything counts that comes my way. If you are somebody who makes Outlander-inspired fan art or jewelry or etc., or something that is in a related topic, and you would like to offer that to me for a giveaway to listeners, let me know. Again, drop me a phone message, 719-425-9444, or leave me an email at contact@adramaofoutlander.com. Or for friends on Facebook, you can pop in and send me a direct message, or through the page or the group as well. So this ended up going way longer than I expected. We're going to be sitting just under an hour, I think. And I'm so grateful to be able to do this every week. It is a labor of love for me, and it keeps me off the streets. Keeps me out of trouble. My husband knows where I'm at. And I appreciate you so much for listening and sticking out with me. We only have, I think, 6 more episodes, and we complete the book. We're coming down to it, people. We're getting there. We're sliding into the home stretch, and then we will do one of the novellas. And until next time, slán je vais.